Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. Throughout the Trump era, those of us who talk about politics, either as professional political commentators, people who post about it online, or people who study it in the academy, have been engaged in a debate about how we see Trump. Is this a fascist moment? Is this a fascist movement? Is what we're looking at an existential threat to liberal democracy? That debate, I think now, is functionally over. With the American state now disappearing people without due process into foreign gulags, arresting political opponents, and, as much as anything, showing a determination to crush all aspects of the culture that do not conform to it, that do not support it, to extract from everyone in the society their not just submission but acquiescence and support of the regime. The issue there, for those of us who talk about politics in whatever capacity, is the vast majority were wrong. The majority position over the last 10 years, from people who write New York Times columns, to people who talk about it online, to, yes, even a lot of professional political scientists, political theorists, has been that while Trump certainly is not good, he's not that bad either. He's not a fascist. We're not looking at a regime-ending movement here. That leaves those of us who thought that we were in a somewhat awkward position. We were right, although we wish more than anything in the world that we were not. So what do we make of all that? What do we learn from that? What do we do differently next time, if there even is a next time? Recently, the online magazine Liberal Currents published 2 articles about this question and how we meet this moment from people who have thought Trump was an existential threat, both of which did the rounds on social media, particularly Blue Sky, I think really resonated with people and got a lot of shares and high-profile engagements. One was from Kevin Elliot, who's my guest today, titled Yes, It's Fascism. The other, I say hopefully not too arrogantly, but without false modesty either, was by myself, and was titled Trump Alarmists Were Right. I'll link to both of those in the episode description. And both of these, I think, really struck a chord with people. People were ready to hear, yes, it's fascism. Yes, those of us who said it was fascism were right. We were right to say it. We weren't just right by accident. We also read each other's articles and shared and positively engaged with each other's articles. So I thought, well, obviously I want to have Kevin come on the podcast and talk about this, and so we did, and I loved having this conversation. Kevin is a political scientist and lecturer in ethics, politics, and economics at Yale University. His main research interests are in political theory and American politics, particularly democratic theory, and he's the author of Democracy for Busy People. What follows here and what you'll hear in this episode is a fairly free-ranging, open conversation about how we got to this point in terms of the debate, why some people got it so wrong and were so unable to course correct, and what does that mean? Where do we go from here? Are we just score settling on our side, or is there something serious and substantive to learn from this? As always, if you like this show, please do consider supporting on Patreon. I don't do any advertisements on the show, I don't have any commercial sponsors, so all of this is made possible by the voluntary support of listeners. If you would like to join them for any amount, you can do so at patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone who does that. And just because it's this episode, I'll add maybe one more reason to consider supporting. And it feels really weird for me to say this. Indeed, this is like my 17th attempt to record this because it just feels awkward to say it myself. But in an age of rising fascism, I think it is important that everyone makes an effort to elevate the media that they want to see more of. And I think, again, in this age, it all really comes down to one question, which is the fascism. We need to boost the voices who have been consistently clear-eyed and consistently opposed to this, and we need to stop supporting people who have obfuscated about it, or denied it, or excused it, or made apologies for it. That support can take many forms. One way, a very important way, is funding it. So if you do appreciate my long-standing Trump alarmism, to use my phrase, please do consider supporting the show. Also, sharing episodes on social media or recommending to friends also is genuinely helpful and genuinely appreciated. Alright, I'll say no more than that. Let's get straight into today's episode. This is It's the Fascism, Stupid, with Kevin Elliot. I am joined today by Kevin Elliot. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So this is a super, perhaps different one, in that normally someone's written a book or said something interesting and I'm interviewing them on that. We've both written popular-facing pieces for the same magazine at about the same time on the same topic of, I guess you could say, like, Bill Clinton had It's the Economy Stupid. We've both done It's the Fascism Stupid pieces. And so I just thought it would be fun to have you on and have a general chat about those.
Yes, absolutely. I think we have been, yes, we are apparently both contributors and readers of Liberal Currents, which I think is doing an excellent job of trying to meet the moment, of attempting to kind of mobilize our various expertises, insights from historical moments, the insights also of political theorists, I suppose, like you and I, philosophers. And yeah, it's really contributing to a discourse that is engaged with what we are dealing with in a way that's not afraid to reach potentially, the most dire conclusions, the most alarming, as the case may be, conclusions about our present moment and what needs to follow, what follows from that. I think one of the things that's been very striking is when we are looking at mainstream media. The New York Times had this editorial board piece come out a few days ago, which was very interesting because it was very good on the diagnostic side. It was like, Trump is doing this, Trump is doing this. Here are these very worrisome developments. And then it was like, and then the so what? And then the practical, the upshot of it was basically like, well, we need to like organize resistance. And it felt very diffuse. The call to action, as it were, did not match. To say that it didn't match it is like match the diagnosis is like comically understated. It was almost like somebody was saying, my car is broken, and the solution is to make spaghetti for dinner tonight. It was like practically they had nothing to do with each other. It was very, very interesting. And it seems to me that Liberal Currents is trying to fill in that space of, well, what if we take seriously what is happening to our country?
Yeah, exactly. And we'll circle back to this towards the end of the interview, but this is one of my central points that I bang on about no end, is in some ways people are incapable of proposing solutions because they haven't understood where they went wrong in their own thought processes. But they've perhaps reckoned that they've got it wrong, but not why.
Yes.
It's that. But let's rewind a little, because I fear we are both deeply, deeply entrenched in this debate, and we might be passing, although I think my listeners probably are too, but we might be passing people by a few layers.
Sure.
You reference in your article something you call it the fascism debate. I've called it alarmist versus anti-alarmist. We could maybe parse those two apart, but just to start with the fascism debate, it might not, to the casual observer, be clear, but there has been an ongoing and oftentimes very bitter and acrimonious dispute between often academics on the left who study political theory, who, this isn't a left versus right thing
No.
necessarily,
Mhm.
about, on the face of it, whether or not we call Trump and MAGA fascists. And this has been going on for as long as Trump's been a politician and has been
Mhm.
quite heated, to put it mildly, right? Do you want to maybe give
Yeah.
us a bit of an overview of like, I mean, we're not going to cover everything because that would be the whole interview, but like,
Right.
yeah, the lead into this moment and what that has looked like.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, the as we call it, the fascism debate is I don't want to call it it's not exactly a misnomer, but that as I mentioned very early in the piece, um, the question of what to call Trumpism, what kind of movement, what kind of politics, maybe we can call it ideology, but what kind of thing it is been in some ways the challenge as Trump has came to power in 2017. People are like, what is this? This looks kind of weird in some ways, kind of familiar in others. There's a long-standing debate in political science over the emergence of right-wing populism as this kind of new emerging style of politics, ideology, political movements, political formations, political parties will be affiliated with this thing that's called populism. But even that term is uh, people disagree about what they take that to be. What this is what is sometimes called the genus problem. What kind of thing is this? Is it an ideology? Similar to something like socialism or liberalism or communism or conservatism. Is populism like that? Or is it more like a rhetoric? Is it just like a way that a certain group of political actors are speaking and communicating and tropes that they're drawing from? Is it something more like a set of strategies? Is it like a logic? There's all these debates about these things um, that have been ongoing for a long time. When Trump comes to power, political scientists, political theorists, political commentators have just been like running around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to figure out what is happening, what is the best set of tools, what are the best terminology, what are the best concepts for understanding what is happening here. And so the so-called fascism debate comes out of this search for the best way to understand this phenomena, the best one of the best tools. And so one of the things that we find is, and you're quite right to point out that this is really not a right-left debate for the most part, right? This is mainly a debate that's going on in the left, center left, where and that's actually not irrelevant. Like the fact that the participants of this are located, some of them more further on the left and some more in the center
Mm-hmm.
left, is quite important because this is to some extent a playing out the this debate is partly a playing out of the intra-left politics. So
Yes.
some people will say exactly, some people will say that Trump represents a kind of fulfillment of this long-standing pathologies that we recognize in American politics when we're further on the left. When we're further on the left, it's like this is a fulfillment of the kind of neoliberal politics, as some would say. Some will say it's a fulfillment of the aggressive militarism of especially the American politics in the post-war on terror era. Um, and so a lot of the skepticism that some people would say, some people will look at Trump and say, this is something new. We need to figure out what it is because it's like a new thing in American politics. And that's people who take that view are likely to say this is some form of fascism, this is some form of authoritarianism. And then other people would say, no, 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 no. This is continuous with these long-standing strains in American politics, and thus if you try to use these other terms, you're going to make it seem as if it's something alien, something strange, an invading new force in American politics, when in fact, it's drawing on these deep resources. So, so this is like this is the kind of landscape that I have seen in this debate. This is sort of how I have understood the debate. I wonder what you note about it. What is your kind of take on that?
The phrase that took me a while to start that sentence. The phrase I've used to describe it is it's kind of a proxy war, is how I've thought about it. So that do we use the literal word fascism? I I personally do. I haven't insisted on it if other people don't. I feel like it's a proxy battle for a few things. It's a proxy battle for to what extent do we see this as contiguous or not? To what extent do we see this as sort of fundamentally different to what's gone before? To what extent is it dangerous and worth panicking about? And almost like everything, like to which side do we feel emotionally aligned in the 2016 Hillary versus Bernie primary? Like it's that thing,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
Like it's the intellectual high church dressed up version of that, right? And
Hmm.
to my mind, I haven't gone super hard. I mean, I have a bit more recently. But like literally on the question, I've sort of thought, well, given it's a proxy war, I'll just fight the war. I'll just be involved in the like what I think is actually at stake here. Which the through line for me personally, I've tried to draw through it is like, to what extent does our narrative about Trump afford the right agency? Do we see him as an action or a reaction? And I'll have that debate. I'll have the debate about how dangerous it is. I think it's very dangerous. And I'll also engage with, as you said, the is it sort of contiguous or aberrant? And my view is actually maybe somewhere in the middle. I do think it's contiguous with some aspects of American history. Certainly, I see Trump in a continuum with Southern white racism and Jim Crow and that history. What I wouldn't say is it's emergent out of the failures of a neoliberal economy. Real though those may be, I just so you can have two separate problems and they're not causally connected, you know? So that's how I've processed that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I hadn't quite connected it to the primary, the 2016 primary, but you're absolutely right, right? That this is the I had this sense that it's like a center left left, but that's of course that's one of these major battlegrounds in recent years, right? For that showdown was that very bitter primary, and has had an enormous sort of the fallout and the bitterness of that particular primary has managed to really cast a long shadow over American politics on the broadly sort of democratic within the Democratic coalition, the left of center coalition. But yeah, I think I'm in a similar place with you with respect to this question of like, are we, how much are we looking at something continuous and how much are we seeing, a break with the past? Um, I've been thinking more and more lately about history and about how this is like, you know, historians, you know, when they when a historian does a project, in some ways, the first thing that they're asking themselves, the first question they have to answer is like, is the thing I'm going to talk about a continuance of the past, or is it a break from the past, right? And I think I spent some time not so long ago trying to look at all of the different explanations that people had floated for Trump. As you say, the fallout of a failed neoliberal political economy, that's a very prominent, very widespread explanation. The drawing on racial backlash and pre-existing deep wells of racism, growing forms of misogyny, LGBT, and especially the trans panic and reaction is against all of those things. And I think one of the factors that was most striking to me, and especially thinking about this post January 6th, was that pretty much all of those other features, with the maybe somewhat exception of American racism being especially kind of has a much more potent history in the United States than in the established European democracies, as racist as they are, as those countries are. They're really none of them have anything quite as profound as the sort of history of racism in the U.S. With that exception, all of the rest of those factors were present in other democracies that had not experienced a January 6th moment. And so for me, it all kind of came down to there is something sui generis, there is something particular about Donald Trump as a person. This is the way that I literally had it on my little whiteboard as I was working through this was summarized with Orange Man bad, which is to say that there is something exceptional about this particular individual, and that all of these other factors might not have germinated, transformed, joined together in quite the way that they did, absent somebody with his particular set of I don't want to call them skills exactly, but his orientations and his pathologies and his narcissism and his, so on and so forth. Take your pick, really. Lack of ideological scruple, lack of political history, all of those types of things. So anyway, right. So that was a big part of the debate. There is also like a meta part of the debate, and I think you were sort of getting to that and speaking about the question of like, is this sort of dangerous or not? Like, or is this just ordinary, the latest version of American conservatism, which we've survived, decades of American conservatism ascendant in power. And I think part of the what I wrote about in that piece in Liberal Currents was trying to kind of differentiate what it would mean for it to be dangerous. Like, and here, I'm a little. I did not speak about this. I didn't write about this in the piece, but I worry about abandoning a term like fascism, which actually has some analytical quality. Um, as some people have said, like, let's not use that term because it's freighted. People don't understand what it means, and they will just want to use it as a polemical term, right? And I think one of the first things I write in the piece is that, like, fascism is not just really bad authoritarianism. It's not just any form of right-wing authoritarianism. That's really not what it is. There's something more particular, something more specific about it. And I think this had been somewhat lost, somewhat obscured in the existing fascist debate, which was, as you say, largely about these more practical questions of just like, you know, where is agency lying? Is this backlash, or is this, affirmative choice of
And
people on the
also
right?
sort of
Yeah.
relitigating existing inter-left bitterness
Yes.
through
Right.
another set of debates, I think. But go on
That's
then.
a, no, that's exactly right. I was just gonna say, yeah, that and the dangerous debate, right? Is that like,
Yeah,
you know, do we need to bury the hatchets, right? Exactly. Do we need to set aside these
yeah.
these bitter debates, or can we keep playing them out? That is to say, if it's super dangerous, then maybe we need to, just swallow our past bitterness within the coalition to move forward present a unified opposition. Um, Anyway, so which is just to say that I do think that there is something sort of unique in that we don't want to just assimilate fascism, the term, to bad right-wing government or something or something
Yeah.
like
So,
that.
so, so tell me about that. How does fascism differ? Because this is something that I think your article updated for me is I had I think in my head been sort of perhaps locating. Well, I'll just let you go, but
Or
you gave quite a clear distinction between fascism and authoritarianism that I found pretty useful. So what is that?
yeah, so I think it helps to start with authoritarianism, right? So uh, which so the question that I begin this piece with is like basically, is what is happening to the American government under the Trump administration, is it an attempt to create a fascist regime in the United States, or is it merely an attempt to bring about an authoritarian regime? Because it seems to be that's the main question at present. Um, and that question actually matters quite a bit because authoritarian regimes are extremely common. They're extremely common historically, they're extremely common even right now. And broadly speaking, and this is something political scientists will tell you, is that like in authoritarian regimes, lots of people can basically their lives are basically normal. They go to work, they come home, they are able to pursue forms of flourishing, and as long as they stay out of politics, they basically are fine and they can live a relatively ordinary life. And that is one of the scary things about authoritarianism, is that like it mostly leaves people alone. Many forms of authoritarianism are about locking down control of the state, the military, and a few like kind of goodies that might be closely associated with the state, maybe oil resources or something like that. But if you're not in those immediate kind of spaces, if you're not contesting control of the state, then you can kind of go about your business. But fascism does not leave you alone. A fascist project, a fascist government, a fascist regime is attempting to impose a relatively comprehensive, broad scope vision of a reformed culture, a reformed society, a reformed artistic milieu, as well as potentially, in most cases, historically economic. And it's really a thoroughgoing project of national renewal, national rebirth. And in that way, it's not going to leave you to your own devices. You are going to be, at some point, asked to be complicit with the regime. You are going to be asked to maybe swear allegiance to the regime. You are going to be asked to become complicit in the crimes, actions of a fascist regime in a way that an authoritarian regime may not actually ask you to. So there's a lot riding on that question, and it is an important analytical, practical distinction, because what does it mean for you is the key pivotal question.
I think that's so right. And I think that is just very obviously true of the Trump regime. You know, we will see how far they succeed. Let me tie that back, and I haven't fully, like, this is a first draft thought, flashed this out, but I think it does relate to the element of historic continuity, because I think a lot of what you described, people could very easily pick up antecedents of that in American conservatism going back decades. I think I would say, yeah, I agree with that, but that is merely to say that there were unaddressed fascist antecedents in American conservatism going back decades. That doesn't mean that this isn't fascism. It means that the roots are deeper and the rot is thicker than just Donald Trump riding down that elevator. One thing a few commentators and have noticed, and that I kind of buy, is that there is this insistence on the part of the modern online right that we pay attention to them, that we listen to them, that we find them cool and funny and amusing. And this is all typified quite nicely in the person of Elon Musk, but they're all like that, all of these posters. It's not enough that the Twitter algorithm is rewritten so that their posts are all at the top. We all have to comment on them. We all have to find them. There's an element of gender here. It's the boys pulling the girl's hair on the playground because they want her attention. And there's this constant caterwauling about how, yes, conservatives might have institutional political dominance, but liberals, we have all the cultural dominance. And the thing is that there's no electoral college or rules of the Senate for culture. Anyone can make a movie, anyone can make art. They're just not very good at it. Like the Daily Wire has tried to make movies and cartoons, and they've had funding, and they're just fucking awful. Like that's not even about their ideology. They're just not good, right? And for all their fury and hatred and disdain of us, is always mingled with this sort of wide-eyed admiration and desire that they be our equals, and desire that we think that they're cool and funny and special, and that we have to, if we do not think these things, we have to pretend that we do. And I see all that as having very deep antecedents going back to, I would say, at least that sort of resentment and desire to be listened to.
Yeah.
Desire for everyone to fawn over them.
Yeah.
I see that as having, not defining the conservative movement, but having antecedents going back into the Gingrich years and Rush Limbaugh and all of that. Certainly, as soon as like online conservatism starts to get going.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, hearing you kind of put it this way and in this context, it makes me think like, so the way that I think about that, as you say, there being these antecedents of this desire for cultural domination, this desire to retake control of the artistic cultural landscape. This is culture war, right? The very concept of culture war, which is the term used for what was it? So there was culture war, there was political correctness, there was wokeness, there's DEI today, wokeness and DEI being the contemporary ones. During George W. Bush's time, they were still talking about political correctness. There's probably another one that I'm missing in that, but these were all languages used by conservatives to contest this cultural hegemony, as they call it, for people that are not on the right. But of course, the key thing, and this gets back to your concern, your ongoing and I think quite important and astute concern about where we locate agency, because when you depict it, when uh, when you accept as a premise of political debate that quote unquote the left has cultural hegemony, well, now you have just framed a gentle story that makes any effort to do conservative politics one of fighting the power, right? That you have turned yourself into an underdog, and you have put yourself in the agential seat, right? You become the protagonist of the story, right? If you're fighting hegemony, because you know that is the dominant way that we think about narratives of conflict, right? We always want to be the underdog. Um, but that's a choice, right? There's a choice to say we are going to talk about ourselves in this way. We are going to emphasize losing ground culturally. We are going to make this assertion about a loss of cultural hegemony the central part of our politics. And this is a thing that older generations of conservatives coming out of the Reagan era would not necessarily have felt as pressing. Jeb Bush did not feel that he was like part of a culturally, marginalized group. This is like not a part of his politics. He's a Bush, right?
Yeah.
He's going to country clubs with the richest and most powerful people in the world, right? They're going to Davos or whatever, right? There's it's with the passing of those groups from power on the American right that you have the installation of this, as you say, the rise of the online right. These people who are clowns, these people who are socially misfit, who are very easy to make fun of. I'm stating this as if it's fact, but the point is that they are outside of the mainstream, even on the right. The mainstream being defined on the right by certain forms of longstanding cultural um, resources and currency, right? And so I suppose with the even in Trump one, you had this hangover of those old style of conservatives. Those were the people who were keeping him in line. Those were the people who were refusing to follow his orders when he would order things that were transparently catastrophic and so forth. Those people are all gone now. And so all that's left are exactly these people who are simply bundles of um, resentment, right? Resentment they've been on my account, they've chosen to accept this story about their own cultural marginalism, right? And that it's now time for them to retake control, I suppose. Even if that requires them to play the cultural, kind of place of, you know, they've been indulging in the aesthetics of evil. I mean, they're perfectly happy to be like take the side of like the Empire in Star Wars or whatever, right? They're happy to be those people because we are in fact storming back to power or whatever. It's quite an interesting transformation of the central tendency of the right, and that seems to be the thing that the more conservative, the more that is to say conventionally conservative, the old style conservatives who are still holding the helms of capital, for instance, and still running big corporations, those people socially are realizing, oh boy, our guys are really not in the driver's seat. It's these other people are now in the driver's seat.
Yes, let me build a few thoughts on this. And again, these are all like half first draft thoughts. One, that is all quite analogous to mid 20th century European fascism. One of the reasons I've not been super into that debate is I'm not a historian of that period, and political theorists often suddenly become historians of that period when they want to make a point, and I've been leery of that tendency. But with that said, I do know that the Nazis were absolutely obsessed with modern art and hating that. There was a similar sort of propensity there. Listening to you talk, it does make me think. We talk about liberal hegemony, and even people on the left can start using that word as if we live in a society whose total structures, rules, and as a Marxist would say, sub and superstructures are all liberal, and that's obviously not true. Our big institutions were not all made by liberals, or often even primarily. But when you think about culture, it strikes me that there's at least two things, with obviously some interconnectivity between them. There's artistic production. There's people who make movies and paint paintings and record music. And I will grant you they tend to be quite liberal, or at least towards the left side. There's probably a disbalance there. I mean, honestly, your average Hollywood producer is probably a very normie Hillary Clinton voter. I don't think we're talking Marxists here, but
Certainly, yeah.
nonetheless, they do skew liberal. But with that said, that's not all that culture is. Culture is when two people go on a date, what do they think they're doing and what do they think they're going to get out of it? Culture is what are the social norms and taboos that would govern a business meeting. Culture is what are what do we think marriage is and what that does and why it's important. And that side of culture, I would say, is still largely, not wholly, but largely conservative. I've written a bit about dating and the many complaints of the right in this respect. One point I haven't made in my articles, but I would make, is if you look at, never mind the aspirations of the very far left or the fears of the very far right, most people exist in long-term monogamous relationships. Yes, divorce has gone up. Yes, single parenthood has gone up, but most people still date for the men and women for the prospect of a long-term partner. The number of sexual partners people have is actually going down. You know, the number of unwanted pregnancies is going down. Most people with extremes on both sides are small c conservative in how they approach this domain. And I'm a liberty principle liberal, cool. I'm not that's neither good nor bad per se. But like if you're having a massive panic about everyone's trans now, they're not. If you're having a massive panic about everyone's radically promiscuous now, they're not. It's actually going the other way. And so I think what's happened, and many on the left side of the spectrum have bought into this, is there's kind of been this conflation of someone who plays guitar in a band. Yeah, that person's left of center statistically, right? No doubt. But that's not everything culture is. And there's been this mishap of, like I say, the Daily Wire cannot make good rock music, it cannot make a Family Guy cartoon, and it cannot make a movie. And because of that, liberalism's culturally dominant. Whereas, in fact, in like how you behave in a board meeting, what couples want in a relationship, that's all small c conservative, as far as I can tell.
Right. Right. Like what are the dimensions of culture that we're interested here? And so there's in a way it's like all the attention is drawn towards these sort of specific bastions, which have, frankly, right? If we're talking about, I often use the term artistic production. When we talk about artistic production, artists have always, always been weird, have always been, we can say liberal, but they've been, that's why they're artists. Like the whole point is that they're looking at things differently. They are interested in expression in ways that are non-standard. The reason many of them feel like they need to do art is precisely because conventional forms of expression and lifestyle and so forth are profoundly fulfilling for them. They feel some kind of need to make the world, to make the vision that they don't see around them. So there's something that misfits them in the world, and so they are going to attempt to express. That is that is what you are doing as an artist in many, many cases. And so it, in a way, the idea of conservative art is in a way almost, I don't want to call it a contradiction in terms, that's going too far perhaps, but conservative art becomes kitsch. It becomes propaganda. It becomes as you say, a sort of a, who would watch a movie about a courtship, a rom-com with no particular comedy that simply unfolds according to boy meets girl, boy and girl like each other, boy and girl get married, boy and girl have 2.5 children and move into the suburbs, right? Nobody's going to watch that. It's boring. It's stupid, right? Because it's so banal. Because precisely as you say, it's small c conservative and familiar to everyone. In order to create something that's worth our attention, in order to create something that is worth debating and and so forth, it cannot reinforce longstanding, um, you know, habits of courtship or cultural power or whatever, because at that point it just stops being something interesting. It just becomes a reiteration of stereotypes and so forth, which we all know. And that's the point, is that we even though, it is a fair critique of Hollywood that their movies are formulaic, and we see a lot of the same kinds of tropes infinitely created and recreated. At the same time, it's not just a kind of propagandistic endeavor. There are these moments uh, for questioning the audience, even in very banal forms of popular culture. That's part of why there's so much interesting kind of cultural talk about it, even in spaces like social media spaces. People are talking about Star Wars and like, what does Star Wars mean? And if you're going to try to tell me that Star Wars has like no political content, I'm just going to say it's all about civil wars. You may have to do a little bit of digging, and maybe there's lots of room for interpretive, things, and also lots of room for criticism or whatever. It's not like you can't work up a politics out of that, or to have a political conversation about it. It's just that, the valence of that politics, but like any good piece of work, of art, the valence of that politically, what it would mean for literally like who's going to be in power in the ensuing days, is going to be open to interpretation. This is why, again, I keep coming back to Star Wars, because it is in some ways the quintessential example of an underdog story, where you have a rebel alliance fighting against an empire, but then um, viewers can slot themselves in, regardless of what their aims are, can slot themselves in as the protagonist, as those rebels against the empire, as we already discussed, the way that many conservatives today will view themselves as rebels trying to blow up the Death Star, and they seem to believe that's sort of what they're doing with the current Trump administration. They have blown it up, like they have seized control of it, and they're trying to blow it up, I suppose. Um, uh, so yeah, so that being a very different kind of a project, very, very importantly, and this gets back to the fascism thing, if what you're trying to do is to explode a hegemony, a cultural hegemony, a kind of liberal, a liberal power structure that is extraordinarily potent and entrenched, then the small c conservative instinct to preserve and to steward is absolutely not appropriate for the job. You must engage in a form of counter-revolution, a type of revolution from the right that is attempting to, you can say reestablish, but you're really talking about sort of reasserting, and almost always in new ways, old hierarchies, right? So the kind of masculinity that's sort of
Yes.
on display is not the same kind that like men in the 50s had. It's like a very different kind of thing.
But the whole culture war and fight for cultural hegemony is also seen through explicitly gendered glasses. What they're seeing in their eyes is the forced feminization of the culture, and what they're asserting is a remasculization of the culture. And then, of course, the other one, as always, with American politics that you can add in is race, in a very, I would say, traditionally fascist way, but with updated language. They see the country not just as being brought down and high crime rates and so on by internal and external racial enemies, but polluted, metaphysically contaminated, impurified by these elements that at once pose physical and metaphysical threat. And trans people fit that very neatly as well, that fascist paradigm of the demonized. They're both a physical threat, women's bathrooms, and a metaphysical threat. They're destroying the idea of gender and this essential category that we supposedly need. So I would say, yeah, once you are, yes, the desire for cultural dominance and to not leave anyone alone, and that is both, and that is profoundly related to both race and gender. And to tie it back to the point, that is kind of, if you once you put that all together, that is what makes it fascist.
Right, exactly. And the places that we're seeing this are in among other, if we when we think about what have been the institutions that have been most instrumental to bringing so in the U.S., Black people in particular, right, and women, what have been the ladders to opportunity? How did we have the first Black president, for instance, right? How did we have well, now two women presidential candidates, one of whom actually won the election by a proper democratic standard, right? How did that happen? Through what institutions did that operate? It operated, among other things, in universities, right? Universities which gave spots for the first time, upward opportunities to receive the credentials, the conventional credentials, the small c conservative credentials that one needs to ascend these long-standing power structures, right? Barack Obama was a graduate of Ivy League institutions and a constitutional law at one of the best universities in the country, which is in the world. That is a very impressive CV before he went into politics and became a United States senator, right? So this is not somebody who was an outsider breaking in, but in fact is somebody who was able to, through the we can call it liberalization, maybe that's not quite the right word, but the opening of opportunities beyond the sort of old lines of racial hierarchy and status. What's the word we use these days? The opportunity hoarding, right? The sort of opportunity hoarding that characterized white supremacy for so long was loosened. It was maybe not obliterated, but certainly was severely loosened, right? That hoarding was increasingly undone. But so then the reaction is now targeting those very institutions in the private sector, in universities, who have allowed the accumulation of power in the hands of women as workers and as educated people, and various forms of ethnic minorities, not just Black Americans, but many other groups. They now have a base of expertise, to some extent wealth, certainly professional and sort of status, basically status in all the ways that these paths to opportunity unlock, and then their presence in these elevated positions is itself a sign of cultural decline.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Cultural crisis, right? That's why the first Black president is like, it is a synecdoche, right, for all of that stuff. That was the sign, that was the flare going up, that's like, oh my God.
Yes. But, and I do really want to stress this, yes, that was the spark that lit the fuel, but there was a lot of fuel there anyway.
Yes,
Right. I don't want to promote a history where if Barack Obama had never won, we wouldn't have had this. This was coming down the drain pipe. That was the inciting incident for them.
Yes.
But to pick it up on the gender side as well, I've spent a bit of time with the so-called manosphere and the sort of low church version of a lot of stuff of this online. And I'm increasingly convinced that a lot of what this is about is, because people say, where's this coming from? And they say, oh, well, women are more equal now. It's a backlash. We've had equal rights law for 50 years now. I think it's specifically about women entering the managerial class. Women, as we know, for some time have been somewhat outpacing men when it comes to professional degrees. That's a huge source of grievance. And the difference is that the young reactionaries online, their fathers had to reconcile themselves to women as peers in the workplace. Young men today will probably be managed by a woman at some point. They'll probably be supervised by a woman. And you might say, so what? And any normal, sane person would say, so what? But to someone with these preloaded biases, or who's being fed these biases through the media they consume online, just as you say, the fact that that person is in the position, this is a sign. This is the culture has gone deeply, deeply, deeply wrong and needs to be totally reordered.
That's right. And that's why that's part of the reason that we call that the proper term for what the Trump regime is attempting to do is fascism. The nature of their vision has a lot of similarities with the old-timey fascism, but it is also new because it is dealing with the anxieties of today, which take a slightly different form. The position of women today is considerably more advanced than it was in Germany in the 30s, right? In the 20s and 30s, even though they were making some advances, certainly in a cosmopolitan city like Berlin in that time. But yes, like the position of women, as you say, I think that's very insightful. That becoming the manager, right, entering the managerial class is again in a similar way that the first black president is a clear, unmistakable sign of advance. Similarly, women in positions of authority manifest day-to-day authority, right? Um, is that kind of presents a kind of locus for resentment. It's like, oh, that's a place that I can locate my unhappiness about the world, about my place in the world, about my lack of skills and attractions, and all of these misfit kind of anxieties that these people who are at the core of this movement um, are attempting to deal with and are bringing into politics and then interpreting it with these tools. So in the piece I talk about, among other things, that what the Trump administration is attempting to do. We have just been talking about things that are fairly diffuse. We're talking about the workplace and we're talking about dating and things like that. So what does this actually mean? Like where do we see the exercise of this agenda? Where do we see the unique fascist agenda at work? One of the ways is in the Trump administration's leveraging of the fact that the federal government is a contractor. So they offer bids and they have thousands and thousands of businesses, small businesses, medium businesses, big businesses, who do business with the federal government, right? They provide services, whatever, the federal government buys stuff from them. And the federal government under Trump has basically told all of these private businesses that, like, if you want to continue doing business with us, you've got to get rid of DEI. You've got to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You got to get rid of any efforts to promote hiring exactly up into the C-suite, right? Trying to bring either marginalized people, either women, into any kind of positions of authority. Whatever efforts you're doing, those need to be discontinued immediately, right? That's how they're trying to use the state, the capture of the state. They are attempting to leverage that to transform the culture, to transform, in this case, the corporate culture, this specific one. Similarly, with universities, if you've been following this news, you're kind of when you're hearing the Trump administration is withdrawing funds, is cutting funding, is suspending grants. One of the important things to understand is that one of the main tools that they're using to do that legally, because all of this is lawless, but there is a fig leaf that's offered, and the fig leaf is civil rights law. Civil rights law is supposed to be used against was sort of created to try to create that opening that allowed someone like Barack Obama to go to the Ivy League and achieve all of these credentials. But the Trump administration is using it the other way around, right? They have basically operationalized the idea that white people face racial discrimination, and they are using civil rights law, not just white people, but also Jewish people, right? This is the anti-Semitism line. They are using laws that were set up to try and protect Black Americans, Hispanic, so on, and they are now using it against universities to try to secure, essentially, well, let's just say, abolish any form of attempt to enable people who are not white to achieve, to excel, to access opportunities in these spaces. That is a way of attempting to push the power of the state into private spaces. That's a fascist project. That's not an authoritarian project, because, among other things, authoritarians want to hold on to power. And the thing about when you push into all the sort of interstitial spaces of society is that people push back. They don't like that. And authoritarians pick their battles. And fascists are like, no, we are going to assert ourselves because, among other things, there's this culture of action and violence and domination. But yeah.
Yeah, no. I've got something to build on that. Yeah, exactly. There's something I've used the word nihilistic, and that's not quite right. I need to find a slightly better one. But there's something about fashion, in a very real and literal sense, it wants us all to die, right? And like, I think one of the things I've just said again and again is they believe this stuff. It's not a smokescreen. It's not people imagine they're opportunistically using the language of race and gender to pick up a few rubes so they can just do the standard oligarchic agenda. And that is true of plenty of mainline conservatives in American history. No, these people believe what they're saying, right? They may be pathological liars, but they're in their core convictions. Um, and one of the things I think we can ascribe a sort of banal pragmatism to people in history that trips us up about this fact. People really struggle with the idea that in the very closing stages of the war, Nazi Germany was devoting precious fuel and precious resources to sending more Jews to the concentration camps that could have been used to put troops on the front line. And people come up with all sorts of bizarro world explanations for this. And I think it's quite mundane. Why was Germany neglecting its war aims to do the Holocaust? Because the Holocaust was one of its war aims. This was one of the things it was trying to achieve in the world, maybe even over and above the survival of the state, right? And I think there's that same kind of like basic category confusion here, in that it's imagined that all of this is in the service of something else, and it isn't. Like, and you can say these people are behaving irrationally. Yeah, maybe by a certain like rational self-interest definition of rationality. Yeah, they're profoundly irrational people. But that is what we're up against here.
Yeah,
It's the real thing.
absolutely. And I think this is why one of the most important pieces, there were two pieces that two additions to the Trumpian repertoire, as I put it in the piece, that simply can't you must simply misperceive reality to deny that he is a fascist now because of two things. One, the first is the sort of ridiculous territorial expansionism, Greenland, Canada, Panama, Gaza to some extent, right? These are the kinds of things that indeed Hitler was doing. Like after his rise to power, the seizure of the Sudetenland, the seizure of the Ruhr, the seizure of Austria, the Anschluss, like these were. This is the kind of thing that literal fascist dictators do. Similarly, right? The Ethiopian War from Italy, right? These like expansionism is what fascists do. The other one is the tariffs, and this is gets to what you were saying, where it's like they really do, So one of the ways that people have in the fascism debate, one of the sides, I suppose, or one of the perspectives that people would bring is that like no, like this is just as you say, inch deep for the rubes to advance the project of capital. This is really just a smokescreen for neoliberalism. And maybe you could have argued that for Trump one. Maybe I don't know. I think this is part of why I wrote the piece now and not during Trump one, because there was a lot of uncertainty, in part because the administration was divided against itself. There wasn't a unified direction in the way that there is more now. More now. I mean, it's still a bit of a bit chaotic, right? In any case, the thing about the tariffs is that they are manifestly not in the service of capital. There is no way to understand the Trump tariffs as in the service of capital as it exists today, as a globe spanning capitalism being a globe spanning network of global trade. It is a trade network. It is about the flow of goods and the flow of capital, not so much people. But that's what it is. And so the tariffs are a monkey wrench is not quite the right word. It's like dropping a bomb into the middle of a machine, right? It is a complete undermining of all of the core assumptions of capitalism as it works today. And the key thing, of course, is that this is exactly what the fascist, especially the Nazis, but the Italians as well. For the Italians had a slightly different situation going on, in part because Italy was so underdeveloped. But in the Nazi state, what they did was economically was that they disciplined capital. They brought capital into the service of the state, and if they were going to aid the purposes of the Nazi state, they would be rewarded. They would get profits. They would get access to goods that would otherwise have been difficult to access due to the profoundly interventionist policies of the Nazi government to interfere with the operation of global trade. And that is where we see, you cannot see the Trump tariffs as inch deep neoliberalism, as pure service of capitalism. They are too destructive of that. It is an attempt to discipline capital and put it in the service of a vision of national greatness, which is truly not in line with a future of ascending capitalist profit and prosperity. It is something else. I'm sure that in this vision, you kind of want some kind of prosperity, but it is conditional. If this prosperity comes at the cost of national greatness, we must not want it, right? It has this like stoic, almost stoic kind of acceptance of poverty.
Let me do a side rant on this one. One of the axioms that the left has, the sort of what I call the anti-establishment left, has repeated for a long time now, which was, I would say, demonstrably falsified both in original fascism and now, is liberals will always side with fascists over socialists because fascists protect capital. And this is, as John Stuart Mill says, one of those things men repeat and repeat until it becomes common sense, but all history refutes. Like, fascists do not protect capital. This is actually one of the reasons, if you want to be cynical about it, why mainline free market liberals do side with socialists over fascists. They are, fascism is profoundly hostile to capital in some sense. The idea that, this is just the same as like, Margaret Thatcher or something. It isn't. This is its own thing. And they really believe it. And whatever else the Second World War did, it was probably not super good for international trade,
There was somebody shared a whatever. There's this graph that goes around on social media that depicts basically the German stock market during the Nazi period, and it kind of just it goes up. It basically goes up, and it's sometimes used by people online to show, oh, see, actually, fascism, Nazism was good for capital. That's what it's meant to demonstrate. But the thing about this graph is that even as they share it, it goes past 1945, and what you will notice is that it goes up and then it drops to zero. So it's a very bizarre thing to claim that, well, for 12 years things were going okay, and then all the money went away. It's a very strange claim to say that that's in service of capital. Another thing to bear in mind here, of course, is that that's a survivor bias thing, right? So like the stock market goes up, quote unquote, the stock market goes up, but that's because the firms that are serving the state are delivered profits. The ones that are serving the aims of the state are getting profits. That's fine. The ones that aren't are going out of business. That doesn't matter for the stock market because because those companies are they're removed from the denominator, you might say. When a company goes out of business, their stock is no longer there on the exchange. Only the ones that are going up will survive. So it's just it's a rather silly thing to say, but the key thing is just to say that capital that serves the fascist project survives and flourishes, and that doesn't is left to wither. That's what happens, right? And so that might look like capital is doing well, but it's only the ones who are doing the bidding of the state. That's not that complicated, right? It's just a way of you have to recognize that the support of capital is fully conditional, and the way to note that this is also what's happening is that those those winners, we might say, those recipients of the profits are typically the beneficiaries of fairly robust forms of specific state policy that's insulating their profits, that's maybe giving them exemptions to various forms of trade barriers or preferential treatment, getting access to foreign exchange, which was the big thing in the Nazi era. So it's very important to bear that in mind. Um, you have to always think about the things that are not obvious, the things that are invisible, the things that are disappearing. Right? Who is gone from this survivorship? We want to try to avoid a kind of survivorship bias by thinking, well, there were all these profitable firms, but what about the ones that were put out of business because they could no longer access foreign markets? Right? Totally a thing.
So let me ask you this though, because so essentially, what's up with the other side then? Because the way you put it, of like you have to just not be observing reality. I feel like my examples are slightly different to yours, but I have a very similar experience of this. And to be fairish, some of the people on the other side of this debate have sort of conceded, okay, yeah, maybe this does look a bit like fascism now, and they've sort of conceded it through grated teeth, but um it's not that we could get into theoretical disagreements, and I'm very happy to, about how you define an ideology. We could get into historic disagreements. There's this sort of, how do you see the role of global capitalism? There's all this intellectual stuff. I get the feeling that there's something a bit more personal to it than that. I wrote this article for Liberal Currents, and I profiled David Brooks, John Stewart, and Corey Robin as centre-right, centre-left, and left examples of people on the other side. And one of the things I really picked up on is how angry all of them were about people saying that they thought Trump was dangerous. It wasn't just mistaken, they were really, really angry about it. And to my mind, it feels like if I was on the other side, surely it's not that big a deal that there's people getting worked up about it. We all agree Trump isn't great. If some people are exaggerating a bit in your eyes, why is that such a problem? You'd think there's almost a sort of reverse Pascal's wager to it. Even if there's only a 2% chance that Trump's a fascist, that's still a bad enough outcome that to have a few people, I would say, for instance, for me, I'm not super convinced by the real worst case scenarios about AI. The worst case scenario is people use it to cheat on their homework. Like, do I think we're going to be in a Terminator place? No. But given that, okay, we don't want to be in a Terminator place, if someone wants to worry about that, I'm not mad that they're doing it, Whereas they were mad that we were worried about Trump. What's up with that?
Yeah, I think a part of it, I think, comes down to a thing that is difficult, and here it matters whether we're talking about left or right, whether center right or far right, right? Because when you think about the right, certainly in Trump one,
take either side of that. Left,
take either
center,
side
right.
of that, right?
Yeah,
they're on the right side. They support many of the things that Trump is doing, right? So they don't want it to be. They're willing to accept essentially. I think just today, as we're recording this, on the 8th of May, the Chief Justice John Roberts said something like, it's the job of the court to push back against the excesses of the executive branch, and that's a kind of a comment from a time warp, because it's like, yeah, I guess so, but like what we're talking about is rampant illegality. What we're talking about is structurally anti-constitutional approaches to using the power of the state to cancel out Congress's power of the purse, among many other things, due process rights and so forth. We're not talking about excesses. We're talking about categorically unconstitutional conduct. And partly, if you want to describe a administration that you largely like what they're doing, but are willing to trim their use what power you have, what influence you have, to try to kind of trim their wings a little bit, maybe even just to reinforce your own power and authority, right? The fact that you are somebody that has to be listened to in the coalition, that's a natural thing for you to say, to make the argument, well, they're not dangerous. That's ridiculous. You might disagree, you might worry about this. There's worrisome things, but not dangers. If it's dangerous, then that would mean that my lack of enthusiastic opposition would be a failure on my part, and I can't be wrong about this. And I think we'll want to talk a little bit about alarmism here. I think going
What
forward,
about the left, though? Because that's the stranger case in some
that is the
people
stranger.
who don't align at all with what Trump's trying to do.
And I think the issue there, your highlighting of the 2016 primary, I think was very helpful, because there I think it's about settling scores within the coalition, right? So it can't be the case that your opponents in the coalition were right about something very important, because then your loss also is a discrediting of various other forms of priorities that you have within the coalition, it seems to me. To say nothing of the fact that if you want to oppose, right, if your analysis of the case of Trump is that he is a continuation of these longstanding trends, especially neoliberal ones that people on the further left have made the center of their politics, you really want that story to be true. And so if he's something fundamentally different, then your analysis of the case is wrong and your agenda is not an appropriate priority for the coalition, shouldn't be. It needs to take this other form to address whatever the danger is by whatever means necessary, which might require popular front tactics, which will necessarily sideline your left agenda.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think it's yeah, I think you don't. There's a real reluctance to admit that my team, my tribe within the overall, left, has maybe got this one wrong. Has maybe, and that's the main pushback I've received. I don't know about you. Is how dare you say? Because I was in that alarmist piece, I was quite careful to include three people from across the spectrum. The people who were concerned by that piece were the left, saying, how dare you say the left has got this wrong? Well, one, I was quite careful to say not everyone on the left. I don't think it is everyone on the left. There's plenty of people who would identify as socialists and so on, who are alarmists, to use my language. But, and it's a big but, there has been a tendency to go into a low agency view of Trump from that section of the left. And I think that section of the left could benefit from taking stock of that, and if that narrative has proved right. And I think, as you say, there's a reluctance to do that because the wine mums who voted for Hillary, well, they can't be right, and it may be no more complicated than that. And as I alluded to, I think there's a gendered aspect to it. I think we've spent a long time coding liberalism as female, and this stuff works subconsciously. I'm not saying people consciously think this, but I think if you just look at how we describe Trump alarmists, it's very overtly gendered. Wine mums, cringe, hysterical, resist libs. These are liberals at brunch. These are all things which are evocative of middle-class women, right?
Or feminized men.
Yes. And that's how we're described and seen. And I think, again, it's subconscious, but there's this sort of thought of the women can't have been right, or the female coded things, the queer coded things can't have been right. I think it's that, and I think it's no more complicated really than I want to defend my team, and if you're attacking my team, I'm going to push back.
Yeah, and it's very tough to say that, right? But it is definitely that is the hydraulics of political affect and what moves people in politics. This is one of the shibboleths of political science, at least some, large sections of it. There's a lot of disagreements within political science, but the importance of identity and the importance of groupiness is very pronounced among a lot of political scientists who will basically tell you that ideology is not the thing. It's not that's only a concern of a very small group of people, and pretty much everybody right, is subject to various forms of social affinity bias and
Right? You have an identity, you have a group, you have many
yeah,
groups sometimes, and you have ideologies. It doesn't have to be either or, but of
yeah.
course there's identity and team loyalty. Of course there is.
And when a coalition begins to
And
expand,
liberals, to be clear, liberals have that too. We all.
yes, absolutely. But right, and I think yeah, the increasing, I think it seems to be like increasingly gendered in the era of Trump. Trump being such a viscerally repellent man, he's a kind of man that a kind of woman in this country has been encountering their entire lives. And so I think that's a big part of what has moved them into the forefront of the imagination regarding who is a characteristic Trump opponent, as you say, the resist lib, is this particular type of person who takes a personal affront, right, to a person like Trump, and this is
Well, I
part of
don't know
Orange.
if you've noticed, but I mean, present company accepted. I have noticed that of the people who fall into the alarmist camp, and I'm not really thinking public figures here, just people I know,
Yeah.
um, definitely skew female. And not like a 60-40 thing, like an 80-20 thing. The people who really have clocked Trump early and seen how dangerous he is early. It's not that there's no men, but it's definitely more women.
Yeah, and that would, I feel like that goes along with and is in service of the Orange Man bad, that there are these unique features of this individual's personality, predilections, history that in particular explain the contours of politics in the era of his prominence, right? It's that it's a particular type of sexist that he is. It's the particular type of uh, well, we don't need to repeat a variety of disparities. They kind of fill out themselves, I suppose. But the particular features of his personality are a very important part of why the politics looks the way that it does, why the coalition looks the way that it does. As I said, Jeb Bush does not in 2016 does not get us the politics of 2025. There's just no way, right?
Yeah, so let's end with this though, because we've prattled on, and I think we've both been feeling a bit Cassandra-ish over the last 10 years. So it can almost be one of the reasons I wrote the alarmist article was always something therapeutic about being like, okay, but we were right. Um, but the pushback might be to both your piece and mine. So what? Like, okay, you guys called it. Sure. So what? What work does that do? What follows from that? Why is that important? Surely what's important now is to just oppose Trump together. You guys seem to have both written articles and then spent an hour talking to each other to settle scores. Is that all we're doing? Is there something more important at stake here?
Right. And that's yeah, and I could not care less about score settling. I was not publishing about this, back in the original iterations, and indeed, like the first kind of, my departure point for writing this fascism piece is just to say that, like, look, that this debate is settled. Like the most prominent the most prominent skeptics have all thrown in the
No,
towel. Pretty
you
much
weren't
everybody.
so much. I was score settling in my piece, but go on.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You've entered the fray perhaps more actively. But the so what, the thing that follows, like the reason I wrote the piece was precisely my piece is precisely that something does come out of this. And I think your piece about alarmism, I think, does a better job of this that is better with forward looking than mine, because one of the things that we have to do from where we are is we have to know who to listen to, right? So there's a lot of things that we need to do going forward. Some of that is practical political strategy, right? What kinds of issues should you know people talk about? What should maybe Democratic elected officials say or talk about or do? What should the agenda for impeachment or removal of Trump look like, right? What kinds of those are all important practical questions, and those fall into that category that I think you were saying, like, we got to move on, let's do opposition. And those are questions about what that opposition should look like. But there's other things that we need to do as well that are more epistemic or epistemological, which is to say, given that we have arrived at the moment that we have, what flows of information should we be exposing ourselves to? Who should we be listening to? moving forward. And this is where your piece on alarmism was so exactly right and so important, because you were giving us a dead simple heuristic for moving forward. You should listen to the people who saw this coming early. You should be maybe following those people on social media. You should be maybe reading the things that they write insofar as they are sort of active and writing in a public facing way. Um, uh, these are the voices, these are the people who have shown the judgment on this particular issue with this particular political moment, with this particular political figure, and so on and so forth. Um, they have been apparently drawing from the right historical ideas, precedents. Perhaps they're using the right, theoretical or philosophical tools or model for thinking about what's going ahead. And so it's precisely those voices that you should be listening to. Those are the people who you should be. You don't have to agree with us. You don't have to, just sort of, delegate your judgment, but that those people are going to be the ones who are going to be arguing with each other, certainly, on some of these other practical questions. And those are the people that we should be prioritizing in our unfortunately limited economy of attention, right? We can only pay attention to so many things. Who should we be filling our minds with? Whose ideas and so forth? That is a question of what's sometimes called political epistemology, which is one of my sort of pet concerns, or not pet concerns. It's a research. It's like a research interest of mine. The intersection between knowledge, how we come to know things about politics, the intersection of knowledge and politics. That's, I think, what you do such a great job on, because the forward-looking agenda is not merely a practical agenda. It is also one about a debate, an ongoing debate, and and that's
yeah, thank you for your kind words. And I'd only add, I also think the converse, which I guess to combine two terms you could call epistemic score settling, which is we need to kind of stop listening to people who were wrong, and particularly people who were wrong, who maybe through gritted teeth have said, yeah, it turned out a bit worse than I thought, but have not made any effort to articulate or to understand why. Who in their head are very much still in the I had good reasons to believe it at the time phase. Like, because I think one, they were clearly looking at the world through the wrong frameworks and haven't updated them. But I would also say that the way that they seem temperamentally unable to update, unable to say publicly, I got it wrong. I've said I got political predictions wrong and all sorts of stuff all the time. The world is a complicated place, and when things don't quite align, sometimes that's luck, but it's just an opportunity to sort of reflect and to think, well, okay, is there something I'm not seeing here? You know?
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of examples I could give of that. But the fact that they're not willing to do that, I think in itself is sort of disqualifying.
Absolutely. The kind of pigheadedness that comes from, this is not just, I guess we sometimes say people will get their backs up about this. It's not about your reputation. It's about getting it right. That's the difference between political epistemology, which is partly this question about what kinds of considerations, interfere or intervene, we can say, maybe not interfere, but that affect our ability to know what's happening and see what's likely. And I think one of the dangers, I just want to kind of add this a little bit. One of the big dangers,
please.
Moving forward, is various forms of confusing prediction and hope with what is actually happening. And so one of the things that I think a lot about these days, and we're seeing political scientists, scholars of authoritarianism, questioning and are writing about, in particular, I think here about someone like Steve Levitsky, Dan Ziblatt. I think they have a piece out. Again, we're recording this on the 8th of May. I think they had a piece just come out, long one in the Times, which I think is very good about this, because the question is how would we know whether democracy was over in the United States? How would we know that fascism was not just ascendant, but in fact had consolidated power and authoritarianism and so forth? That is an epistemological question. It's very difficult to know. And one of the I don't want to say problems. One very prominent argument in political science about what characterizes democracy is that there are elections that the incumbents can lose. can lose. That's quite a difficult epistemologically. You can't know before the election is held whether it is an election that the incumbent could lose or not. It's only when they lose it that you know that they could have lost it, actually, right? Because if they win, then you don't know for sure. So one of the things that I believe it was Levitsky said recently was that the fact that people in the United States are telling you that these are people in universities, these are people in corporations, these are people in law, in big law firms, these are people in the media. They are telling you that they're afraid. There are also members of Congress who will say off the record, members of, I think these were Republicans in the Senate, who are saying that, like, I'm afraid for my safety if I were to oppose Donald Trump. That's the type of their claim was that, like, that presence of fear is itself a sign that democracy as we know it is over and that we are no longer living in democracy. There's some kind of authoritarian regime. That doesn't mean that it's consolidated power. It doesn't mean they can't lose, but it does mean that we have entered a new phase of American political history. That seems to me to be quite important to accept as a fact, as a starting place to move forward from. But it does require you to have the courage to accept that, as you say, if you weren't one of the alarmists, that you were wrong, or at least you weren't seeing what was happening. You missed something. And now we have to move forward on the assumption that you were wrong or that you missed something, and that we need to proceed on the assumptions of these other people who maybe you don't like for a variety of reasons because of social or cultural or identity reasons.
Yeah, yeah. And, I think there's an updating for us all, though. There's, yes, certainly the people who argued vociferously that it wasn't that dangerous have to update. And I don't think they will update. They have to be sidelined. Right, we have to stop listening to them.
That's right.
But there's also an updating for all of us. Until I think reasonably recently, we might talk about protecting the underlying constitutional order from Trump. I think that is gone now, and there's no sense of trying to get back there. I think merely even as a matter of messaging, we can no longer talk about a return to. We are going to have to build, and that is assuming we do not just descend into wholesale fascism, which I think is an option that is on the table, but we are going to have to build a new type of regime. And I do not think that will be something as wonderful as utopian socialism. I do not think it will be what came before. We are just going to have to stitch together fragments of the old world into something else. And that is a daunting fucking task, but people throughout history have been faced with it. And that is just where we land and where we find ourselves now.
That's absolutely right. I am on the record saying that I think people who are engaged in that project and who understand that we are the only agenda is a remaking one. As you say, there is no going back, there is no restoration. I do think that people who are engaged in that project should help themselves liberally to the rhetoric of restoration, because as you say, we are stitching together, we are going to attempt to restore something of the past, right? But it's not anyone who's just like, well, we just need to go back to, anyone who isn't using that merely as a kind of rhetorical touchstone, but who really means that we want to return, that we want to restore. Those, as you say, those people need to not be listened to. But people moving forward who understand the brief, as you put it, because you put it exactly right. There is no going back. There is only moving forward, and there is only a very daunting agenda of constitutional reform ahead of us. That is, and I don't necessarily mean the formal amendment process. I do mean the Constitution in a much more informal and expansive way. That is the agenda. That is the only agenda. It will have to be reform. It will have to be moving forward. It will have to be a change in very fundamental ways. But that is a way of restoring a kind of constitution that we can be proud of. It is a way of restoring certainly American democracy as this kind of somewhat more abstract constitutional principle. And I don't think we should shy away from that, but it is definitely not a return to something that was working just fine and had no problems, because it clearly was vulnerable to the kind of moment that we find ourselves in. In all of its horror.
let's end on that. Optimistic. Maybe somewhat bittersweet note.
Bittersweet. I think that's right. I think it is important to bear in mind that that this is an opportunity for a discredited status quo to be swept aside.
Yes.
And those who liked things about it can try to advocate for those elements of it that are good, but they must accept that core elements of it have to go.
Yeah, and I would say perhaps as an olive branch to those on the anti-establishment left who have long felt that a corrupt status quo isn't worth defending. To put it bluntly, well, it's fucking gone now. Like, like I
Yes.
opposed you at the time when Susan Sarandon said Trump would bring the revolution. That seemed like a foolish political strategy to me. And indeed, he did not. However, I felt that even existing liberalism was worth defending. It is gone now. Like, I did not think the acceleration plan was a good one. I do not think some utopian socialism will come out of it. However, my friend, we are fucking here now and we have to rebuild. And fuck it, let's be creative. Let's think outside the box. Let's hear your ideas. But we have to at least be on the same page that this is fascism now. But then yeah, I agree. We are not going back. Regardless of if it's desirable, it is no longer possible. So come on then. What let's hear your wildest thoughts on what we do with this.
That's what I spend an unhealthy amount of my time on social media doing is dreaming these dreams and talking about hopefully usually historically informed ideas of where to go from here. That was, I'll just say one very last thing, as I said, the thing about the past, the thing that's good about thinking about the past in other countries is that we know something that has already happened is possible. If something hasn't happened, we don't know for sure whether it's possible. That's why it's worth studying other countries in history, because those things we know are possible.
Yeah, yeah. All right. I always ask people where to go to follow us. Let's do a few plugs to end with because we've just talked about who we should listen to. You're on Blue Sky. People should follow you there. We should also plug Liberal Currents, who we've both been writing for. And I think genuinely, not just to plug something where our articles are genuinely filling an important void that needs to be elevated as much as possible.
Agree.
Relative to fucking New York Times of the world and so on, right? I actually have a starter pack of people we group sourced of people who called Trump early, so you can follow that. That's on my starter pack. Where else? Follow you. Where else should listeners go?
Right. I do think you should be looking at political scientists, particularly people who study authoritarianism. Tom Popinski comes to mind, who's fairly active on Blue Sky. But if you are a non-political scientist, the kind of political scientist you want to be looking at are people who study authoritarianism, people who study, in particular, comparative politics. So there are typically four traditional subfields in political science: theory, American politics, comparative politics, and international relations. IR people and comparativists, but particularly comparativists, have been very good and very good to listen to. Political theorists, we're a mixed bag. This is where I mostly locate myself. American politics people have been decidedly somewhat also hit and miss for a variety of interesting historical reasons. But I would say that when you're looking at people to study, I think you really are. It's hard to go wrong with people who are aware of the history of authoritarianism and particularly also of democratization and its history. These are people who recognize things that are family resemblance type happenings. So that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on. I feel like I could have done another hour on the future. We'll have to get you back on for that, but real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.